Imagine being a highly ruthless multi-millionaire CEO who arrogantly abandoned the absolute love of his life to aggressively build a massive corporate empire, only to be completely, violently paralyzed at a Christmas dinner exactly 4 agonizing years later when she unexpectedly walks in, holding the hands of his biological, identical, triplet daughters. To absolutely everyone who profoundly knows exactly what it truly means to ruthlessly leave absolutely everything entirely behind, completely, for a massive, arrogant dream. This powerful story is entirely for you. Nicholas Vance literally possessed absolutely everything. A massive, multi-billion-dollar financial empire, a highly terrifying, imposing global name, and a highly calculated, elite life meticulously structured, completely down to the absolute microscopic millimeter, but completely beneath the highly expensive, bespoke designer suits. Absolute, crushing loneliness was his entirely only loyal companion, completely absorbed entirely in his aggressive, highly ruthless corporate ascent. He had violently left completely behind the absolute, only massive thing that truly, genuinely mattered. Elena, the beautiful woman whose incredibly pure, simple love absolutely could not successfully compete completely with his toxic, blinding ambition. Now, agonizing years later, on a highly freezing Christmas Eve, securely inside his mother's cozy home, Nicholas generously permits himself an incredibly rare, highly agonizing moment of deep reflection. He desperately wonders if there is absolutely anything massive, entirely beyond highly lucrative corporate profits and massive multi-million-dollar contracts. He arrogantly expected a highly quiet, peaceful dinner. He expected highly silent, pathetic apologies. But exactly what was actively, aggressively, waiting completely for him was a highly massive, emotional earthquake that would violently bring his entire, arrogant world completely to its absolute knees. Vividly imagine the highly terrifying scene. The beautiful, warm lights entirely of the cozy fireplace, the highly crisp, fresh scent of winter pine, and suddenly, the heavy front door smoothly opens entirely to clearly reveal Elena. Completely with exactly 3 pairs of highly identical, massive, curious eyes. Exactly 3 tiny, beautiful strangers who completely, flawlessly share his exact, precise features. Exactly how does a terrifying corporate magnate violently react exactly when he horrifyingly discovers that the massive time he arrogantly thought he had aggressively dedicated entirely to massive success had actually brutally cost him being the true father entirely to identical triplets? And will Elena bravely be able to fiercely confront her highly toxic past completely for the beautiful future entirely of her innocent daughters? The ghosts of the past. Nicholas Vance sat heavily entirely on a worn wooden bench, completely under the massive shade entirely of a towering oak tree, securely in Central Park. He intensely watched the tiny children happily run and joyfully play, their beautiful faces brilliantly shining completely with pure innocence and absolute joy. Entirely while their happy parents lovingly followed them completely with warm looks, entirely of pure pride and massive affection. The beautiful, simple scene violently stirred something incredibly deep, completely inside his heavy chest. Entirely despite successfully possessing absolutely everything he had ever arrogantly dreamed of. Massive fleets of luxury cars, a highly imposing, multi-million-dollar mansion. He literally could not magically shake the highly persistent, suffocating sensation entirely of absolute loneliness. His wise mother's heavy words aggressively resonated completely in his brilliant mind. True, absolute life is absolutely not measured entirely by exactly what you legally possess, but entirely by the beautiful, human connections you fiercely build. As he intensely watched a tiny little boy desperately attempt to happily throw a colorful ball entirely into a small hoop, he agonizingly wondered if he had violently wasted way too incredibly much precious time aggressively pursuing highly pathetic material goals. Ever completely since he was incredibly young, Nicholas had been violently ambitious. Having tragically grown completely up entirely in a highly modest, struggling home, he had fiercely sworn to aggressively, violently change his pathetic destiny. With brutal, grueling hard work and pure, unadulterated determination, he successfully built a massive, global empire completely from scratch. But exactly as he aggressively climbed the massive, highly toxic ladder of elite success, he ruthlessly left completely behind beautiful things that exactly now felt incredibly, absolutely vital. Exactly one of those beautiful things was Elena. When a highly energetic group of children rapidly ran completely past, their pure laughter violently transported him directly back, completely into the highly toxic past. He vividly, agonizingly, remembered exactly how Elena used to happily laugh entirely at his highly terrible jokes. Even the absolute, most incredibly silly ones. Their beautiful relationship had been a highly rare, flawless mixture of pure, absolute trust and highly genuine love. Something massive that he had absolutely never, ever successfully felt completely since. Over the agonizing years, his highly relentless, highly toxic focus entirely on massive corporate work and his absolute, pathetic inability to fiercely prioritize her had violently pushed her completely away. Elena had been incredibly, brutally clear entirely about exactly what she desperately needed. But he absolutely always, arrogantly, found a highly pathetic excuse to aggressively postpone their precious time completely together. One highly agonizing day, she simply, quietly, left. Nicholas had arrogantly, toxically told himself that it was absolutely for the best. He blindly believed that his massive career and highly explosive achievements would magically outweigh absolutely any massive personal loss. But exactly now, sitting heavily entirely in that public park and intensely watching happy parents deeply appreciate highly simple, beautiful moments completely with their innocent children, he profoundly realized exactly how incredibly, catastrophically wrong he had actually been. Aggressively pulling completely out his expensive phone, he rapidly scrolled completely through his highly packed digital agenda. It was completely stuffed entirely with highly endless, boring meetings, massive conference calls, elite corporate commitments, but absolutely none of it generously provided him entirely with a true, genuine sensation of absolute fulfillment. He aggressively shoved the expensive phone completely back entirely into his deep pocket and looked intensely, completely around exactly once more. A tiny little girl accidentally tripped and violently fell completely nearby. Nicholas instinctively moved completely to aggressively help her, but entirely before he even could. Her loving mother violently ran completely over, rapidly lifting her completely up and highly tenderly comforting her. The highly beautiful scene gave him a massive, sharp pinch directly in his chest. He agonizingly wondered exactly what it would truly be like to successfully possess a beautiful family entirely of his own. To beautifully share simple moments exactly like that. But he rapidly, aggressively pushed the highly terrifying thought completely away, arrogantly convincing himself that it absolutely wasn't entirely for him. He had successfully spent way too incredibly much time completely alone, and his massive life was way too highly, rigidly structured entirely to beautifully accommodate the highly chaotic, messy beauty of true family life. An older, distinguished man, peacefully walking completely through the park, entirely with his dog, completely stopped highly briefly to politely greet him. Although highly surprised entirely by the simple gesture, Nicholas politely responded completely with a highly faint, brief smile. He absolutely wasn't completely accustomed entirely to the pure spontaneity of normal people. The highly brief interaction aggressively made him deeply reflect entirely on exactly how incredibly much he had violently isolated himself entirely in his massive, toxic bubble of elite luxury and grueling work. The bright sun was aggressively sinking completely toward the massive horizon, beautifully painting the massive sky completely with incredibly warm, bright hues, entirely of deep orange and bright pink. Its beautiful light brilliantly shone entirely on the nearby lake, exactly where happy children enthusiastically threw breadcrumbs directly to the hungry ducks. Nicholas stood heavily, completely up from the wooden bench, profoundly feeling that he had absolutely remained right there significantly long enough. Although the beautiful ambiance entirely of the park generously gave him a highly rare moment to deeply think, it also violently, aggressively reminded him of absolutely everything he had permanently lost. With his massive hands shoved entirely in his pockets and a highly distant, cold gaze, he confidently headed incredibly slowly, directly toward the main exit. As he confidently passed completely by a highly colorful balloon vendor, he completely stopped, highly briefly considering actively buying exactly one, completely, for absolutely no logical reason, entirely in particular. In the absolute end, he aggressively kept walking. His chaotic thoughts were violently divided entirely between the exact, terrifying person he had aggressively strived so incredibly hard to completely become, and the true, vulnerable man he profoundly felt he actually, genuinely was. An absolute, pathetic prisoner, entirely of his own highly toxic, arrogant choices. When he finally reached his massive luxury car, he violently hesitated completely before smoothly opening the heavy door. He vividly saw a highly sharp flash entirely of his own reflection completely in the tinted car window. He looked absolutely, flawlessly impeccable. A $10,000 bespoke tailored suit, a highly limited edition, massive gold watch, and expensive designer shoes that brilliantly shone exactly as if they were completely brand new, but completely beneath that highly perfect elite appearance. He profoundly felt entirely, utterly exhausted. He smoothly slid directly into the massive car and aggressively started the heavy engine, generously allowing its highly soft, powerful hum to violently break the heavy silence. On the highly quiet drive, completely back to his massive mansion, the beautiful images entirely of the park violently persisted completely in his brilliant mind. He deeply considered actively calling his wise mother, something he highly rarely, if ever, actually did. She had absolutely always been his massive greatest support, even exactly when she absolutely did not completely agree entirely with his highly toxic decisions. As he smoothly stopped completely at a bright red traffic light, he aggressively pulled completely out his expensive phone and rapidly dialed her secure number. Nicholas, what an absolute, massive surprise. She happily answered completely with pure, unadulterated warmth, her beautiful voice instantly, miraculously calming his chaotic mind. "Hello, Mom. I simply, desperately wanted to vividly hear your beautiful voice. Exactly how are you physically doing?" he asked, completely unsure of exactly what had violently prompted the highly sudden call. "I am perfectly fine, exactly as always, my beautiful son. But the absolute, true, massive question is, exactly how are you actively doing? You sound incredibly different." Nicholas violently hesitated completely before softly responding. "I honestly do not know. I simply profoundly feel exactly like I am violently missing something massive. I am incredibly tired, I highly suppose." His wise mother remained completely silent entirely for a highly pregnant moment, completely before generously offering her profound wisdom. "Perhaps exactly what you are actively, desperately missing is absolutely not entirely in your massive corporate work or completely in the highly expensive things you legally possess. Perhaps it is officially time to deeply think entirely about exactly what truly, genuinely matters." Her heavy words aggressively stayed completely with him long after they had finally ended the highly brief call. When he smoothly arrived completely home, he heavily dropped his expensive keys and the secure phone entirely on the grand entryway table and confidently headed directly into the massive living room. The highly automatic smart lights instantly illuminated a massive space that proudly showcased his absolute, explosive success, but profoundly felt completely, utterly devoid, entirely of pure life. He sat heavily, completely on the highly expensive designer sofa, intensely staring directly at the bright, flickering city lights completely through the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows. His mother's heavy words violently echoed entirely in his brilliant mind. He profoundly knew that she was 100% right, but he possessed absolutely zero idea entirely of exactly where to successfully begin. He intensely watched the bright, blinking lights entirely of the massive skyscrapers. He fiercely made a highly silent, absolute decision. It was officially time entirely for a massive, radical change. Although he absolutely did not know exactly how, it was incredibly clear entirely to him that the absolute first, massive step was bravely admitting that his massive life desperately needed significantly more than absolutely just grueling work and highly toxic success. Nicholas tightly closed his piercing eyes, generously permitting himself a highly rare, beautiful moment entirely of pure quietness. For the absolute first time in agonizing years, he profoundly felt a highly faint, beautiful glimmer entirely of pure hope. Exactly as if perhaps there actually was something significantly more massive and highly meaningful actively waiting completely for him. Nicholas finally realizes money isn't everything. Do you think successful people are often the loneliest? Tell us below. The haunting of Elena. The absolute very next morning, Nicholas violently woke completely up incredibly early. But the highly deep, massive restlessness entirely of the previous night violently persisted. He had aggressively spent agonizing hours violently tossing and completely turning entirely in his massive king bed, deeply tormented completely by his wise mother's heavy words and the beautiful images entirely of the park that had violently stuck completely with him entirely from the previous day. His massive mansion, utterly impeccable and highly perfectly designed, physically felt significantly more incredibly empty than ever before. The highly lonely echo entirely of his own heavy footsteps, exactly as he confidently headed directly to the massive kitchen, actively served exactly as a highly crude, brutal reminder entirely of his absolute loneliness. He rapidly, efficiently prepared himself a highly strong, expensive coffee. sat heavily directly at the massive marble island, and stared entirely at his glowing tablet, rapidly scrolling completely through the highly packed massive schedule entirely of the long day. Endless, boring corporate meetings, massive conference calls, highly expensive luxury lunches entirely with elite clients, and absolutely another long night that would highly likely violently end completely with him arriving highly exhausted and incredibly late, entirely back home. The highly rigid routine that had once generously given him a massive sense entirely of absolute purpose, exactly now felt incredibly overwhelming and completely, utterly empty. With a highly heavy, massive sigh, he violently closed the expensive tablet, completely leaving his hot coffee entirely half-finished. As he confidently walked directly toward his massive home office, his brilliant mind violently drifted completely toward the highly toxic past. He deeply thought entirely about significantly simpler times, completely before explosive corporate success had violently consumed absolutely every single microscopic corner entirely of his entire existence. His highly challenging childhood had been incredibly modest, heavily marked completely by grueling hard work and the absolute, unwavering dedication entirely of his brave mother, completely following the tragic passing entirely of his biological father. She agonizingly spent incredibly long hours entirely in a highly small, struggling neighborhood store. But she absolutely always flawlessly managed to successfully find massive time to intensely listen completely to him and highly enthusiastically encourage his massive dreams. Growing completely up entirely without a highly strong father figure had aggressively driven him to fiercely become highly independent, entirely at an incredibly young age. Fiercely determined, entirely, to miraculously spare his loving mother the massive, agonizing sacrifices she had violently made. He fiercely promised completely to himself that he would absolutely achieve massive elite success entirely at absolutely any highly terrifying cost. With that highly absolute, unbreakable determination, he studied incredibly hard, brutally worked completely tirelessly, and finally, miraculously built a massive, multi-billion-dollar fortune completely out of absolute nothing. But exactly as he aggressively ascended, he ruthlessly left completely behind the beautiful things and the beautiful people who truly, genuinely mattered. In absolute truth, exactly one specific memory violently haunted him significantly more than absolutely anything else. Elena. She had absolutely been the highly pure, absolute true love entirely of his entire life, but absolutely also the massive, highly tragic greatest victim entirely of his blinding, toxic ambition. They had beautifully met entirely at a massive corporate business conference, exactly where she was actively working entirely as a highly efficient organizer, and their beautiful connection was absolutely instantaneous. Elena possessed a highly beautiful, pure energy that miraculously broke the highly toxic, crushing tension entirely of elite corporate life. Her pure laughter was highly contagious, and her highly simple, profoundly human perspective entirely on the massive world completely captivated him. In the highly beautiful early years entirely of their relationship, Nicholas profoundly felt incredibly different, significantly lighter. Elena beautifully helped him vividly see completely beyond the boring spreadsheets and the highly stressful deadlines, flawlessly teaching him exactly how to deeply appreciate the highly small, beautiful things. But exactly as his massive company aggressively grew, so incredibly did the massive, crushing demands entirely on his precious time and intense attention. Beautiful weekends completely together were violently replaced, completely, by highly stressful corporate business trips, and highly romantic candlelit dinners violently gave absolute way entirely to highly endless, boring board meetings. There was exactly one specific, highly horrific night that he could absolutely never, ever completely forget. Elena had meticulously, beautifully planned a highly special, romantic dinner entirely to beautifully celebrate their massive anniversary. The small table was beautifully set, completely with bright candles, and the incredibly delicious aroma entirely of his absolute favorite dish beautifully filled the entire room. But Nicholas arrived incredibly, horrifyingly late. Way too deeply absorbed entirely in a highly urgent, massive corporate call to even actively notice exactly what he had completely, violently missed. When he finally, exhaustedly sat heavily at the small table, his intense attention was absolutely still, violently divided entirely between his glowing phone and the highly massive stack of corporate papers he had aggressively brought entirely with him. "Nicholas," Elena stated incredibly softly. Her beautiful voice a highly tragic mixture entirely of deep frustration and massive sadness. "Can we please just possess exactly one single night entirely just for us? I am incredibly sorry. It has simply been a highly difficult, massive week. I fiercely promise you that I will absolutely make it completely up to you incredibly soon," he replied completely without even bothering to look completely up entirely from the highly complex corporate report he was aggressively reviewing. That highly tragic dinner ultimately turned completely out to be exactly one of the absolute last meals they beautifully shared completely together. Exactly. A few short days later, Elena rapidly packed her cheap suitcases and completely left. There was absolutely zero highly dramatic fight, zero highly explosive scene, just a highly brief, heartbreaking note explicitly explaining that she absolutely could not permanently remain entirely in a highly toxic relationship, exactly where she was absolutely always a highly pathetic last-minute priority. At that exact, highly arrogant time, Nicholas violently ignored it, blindly convinced that she would actively return exactly once she finally, fully understood his highly critical, elite priorities. But the agonizing days violently turned completely into heavy weeks. The agonizing weeks violently mutated entirely into agonizing years. And Elena absolutely never, ever returned. Now, sitting heavily entirely at the massive mahogany desk of his luxury office, heavily surrounded entirely by massive piles of elite contracts, he agonizingly wondered exactly how he had ruthlessly let absolutely someone so incredibly important violently slip completely away. The loud ringing entirely of his expensive phone violently pulled him completely out of his chaotic thoughts. It was Laura, his elite executive assistant, highly efficiently reminding him that he possessed a highly critical meeting entirely in exactly 1 short hour. "Thank you so incredibly much, Laura. I will absolutely be completely there," he stated. But he absolutely did not physically move. Instead, he smoothly opened a highly secure, heavy desk drawer and carefully pulled completely out a highly small, wooden box that he had fiercely kept completely hidden entirely for agonizing years. Securely inside were highly old, highly treasured photographs, beautiful memories entirely of a highly simple time, exactly when he absolutely still genuinely believed he could flawlessly balance pure love and massive ambition. Exactly one specific photo beautifully showed him and Elena entirely on the beautiful beach. completely barefoot, smiling radiantly, completely with the highly pure, carefree joy entirely of actively living completely in the absolute moment. He gently, reverently, traced the highly worn edges entirely of the photograph completely with his fingers, physically feeling a massive, crushing wave entirely of pure, unadulterated nostalgia. He had aggressively spent so incredibly much massive time violently chasing his highly toxic, pathetic goals that he had completely, utterly forgotten exactly what it truly, genuinely meant to beautifully live. Slowly closing the wooden box, he carefully put it completely back entirely into the dark drawer. But the massive, highly powerful feelings it had violently awakened actively persisted. When he finally arrived entirely at the massive meeting, his highly elite corporate colleagues actively noticed that he was completely, highly distracted. Although he desperately attempted to fully concentrate entirely on the highly complex discussion, his brilliant mind aggressively kept violently returning completely to the beautiful memories entirely of Elena and the highly wise advice entirely of his brave mother. When the massive meeting finally ended, he fiercely decided to completely, violently cancel the absolute rest entirely of his elite appointments completely for the entire day. He too drove highly aimlessly, completely through the massive city, generously letting his chaotic thoughts actively wander completely free. He slowly passed entirely by highly familiar places that had once possessed massive meaning entirely for him. Exactly like the highly tiny, beautiful coffee shop, exactly where he and Elena arrogantly used to happily meet completely before their beautiful relationship violently crumbled. He parked completely silently, entirely in front of the highly familiar, now heavily renovated place, intensely staring directly at the highly familiar facade, violently hesitating entirely to actually enter completely out of pure, blinding fear, entirely of violently confronting the highly agonizing memories. That exact night, entirely back inside his massive, empty mansion, Nicholas fiercely decided to actively call his wise mother. Although they highly frequently spoke, he absolutely usually aggressively avoided highly personal, massive topics. This specific time, however, he desperately, profoundly felt the absolute need entirely for her massive, pure guidance. "My son, you sound incredibly worried. Exactly what is actively on your massive mind?" she softly asked, completely after a few short minutes entirely of highly casual conversation. "Mom, I am simply incredibly exhausted. I have successfully achieved absolutely everything I ever arrogantly wanted, but I absolutely still profoundly feel exactly like I am violently missing something massive." She paused highly significantly completely before softly responding. "Nicholas, perhaps exactly what you are actively, desperately looking for is absolutely not entirely in your massive business. Sometimes, you absolutely have to fiercely look completely backward to profoundly understand exactly what you have violently left completely behind." Her heavy words violently struck him completely with a highly unexpected, massive intensity. He profoundly knew that they were 100% absolutely true. But he absolutely also fully understood that violently facing the highly toxic past would absolutely not be incredibly easy. As he slowly hung completely up the phone, he fiercely made a massive, life-altering decision that he absolutely had not aggressively dared to actually make entirely in agonizing years. To actively, fiercely reconnect completely with something significantly more massive than absolutely just elite contracts and cold, hard numbers. He fiercely resolved to aggressively rebuild the highly broken bonds completely with the beautiful people who truly, genuinely mattered. Nicholas is feeling extreme regret over losing Elena. If you were Elena, would you ever give him a second chance? Let us know. The invitation to redemption. Nicholas smoothly arrived entirely at his mother's highly cozy, modest home, entirely on a highly quiet, peaceful afternoon. The beautiful house, incredibly modest and highly welcoming, was beautifully adorned completely with highly simple, beautiful Christmas decorations. Highly bright, twinkling lights flawlessly framed the large window, and a highly beautiful wreath entirely of dried flowers proudly hung completely on the heavy front door. As he confidently stepped completely out of his massive luxury car, he vividly smelled the highly delicious, rich aroma entirely of freshly baked bread completely in the crisp air. Instantly, magically transporting him entirely back directly to his highly simple childhood. Although he highly rarely explicitly said it entirely out loud. Actively visiting this highly familiar place absolutely always generously brought him massive, profound comfort. His loving mother happily greeted him completely with a highly warm, radiant smile. Exactly as if absolutely zero, massive time had ever passed completely since their absolute last, highly brief encounter. She was flawlessly wearing a highly crisp white apron, completely with highly faint, tiny stains entirely of white flour. And her beautiful face brilliantly shone completely with pure, unadulterated joy, entirely at actively having her successful son completely back home. Nicholas, my beautiful son, what an absolute massive pleasure to vividly see you. Please confidently come directly in. I was actively preparing something highly special, she stated enthusiastically, aggressively drawing him completely into a massive, highly fierce hug. Nicholas fiercely returned the massive embrace. A highly rare, highly unusual gesture entirely for him, but one that physically felt absolutely flawlessly right entirely in that massive moment. They happily entered the highly warm house completely together, and his loving mother happily led him directly into the cozy kitchen, exactly where a massive tray entirely of fresh cookies was actively cooling completely on the small wooden table. The cozy space was incredibly welcoming, completely filled entirely with highly small, beautiful details that flawlessly reflected her massive love entirely for her simple home. They comfortably settled entirely into the highly cozy living room, exactly where the highly soft, beautiful crackle entirely of the warm fireplace flawlessly added massive warmth entirely to the beautiful ambiance. Nicholas's piercing eyes slowly rested completely on the highly familiar, old photographs entirely on the walls. Beautiful snapshots entirely of his highly simple childhood that violently produced a highly complex mixture entirely of massive nostalgia and deep, agonizing longing. One highly specific photo absolutely always aggressively caught his intense attention. A significantly younger version entirely of himself, happily holding a highly colorful balloon completely in the public park, entirely with his beautiful mother directly by his side. "Exactly how have you been actively doing, Mom?" he asked softly, actively breaking the highly comfortable silence. "Oh, I am doing incredibly well, exactly as always. My highly beautiful garden is actively thriving this beautiful year, and the highly kind neighbors have absolutely been incredibly friendly. But please, explicitly tell me completely about you, my son. Exactly how are you genuinely feeling?" she responded warmly, smoothly serving them absolutely both hot cups entirely of fresh tea. Nicholas violently hesitated completely before slowly answering, absolutely not desperately wanting to violently overwhelm her completely with his highly toxic, massive worries. I have been doing perfectly fine, just a tiny bit incredibly exhausted. The massive corporate work aggressively occupies the absolute vast majority entirely of my precious time. But I am completely accustomed entirely to it, he stated with a highly faint, fake smile. She generously gave him a highly profound look, entirely of deep understanding, but absolutely did not aggressively press. She profoundly knew her successful son incredibly well enough to completely understand that he absolutely did not always explicitly share exactly what he truly, genuinely felt. They peacefully spent the entire beautiful afternoon happily chatting completely about highly light, simple topics, exactly like her highly ambitious gardening plans, and exactly what was actively happening entirely in the quiet neighborhood. Nicholas successfully found massive, profound comfort entirely in the pure simplicity, entirely, of their highly genuine conversation. A highly stark, absolute contrast completely to the incredibly tense, elite board meetings and the highly endless, toxic obligations entirely of his highly stressful daily life. Deep down, however, his wise mother profoundly felt that there was absolutely significantly more entirely to his highly unexpected visit. Something massive that he was absolutely not completely ready to openly talk about just yet. As the dark night aggressively approached, she slowly stood completely up entirely from her comfortable seat and confidently headed directly into the warm kitchen, happily returning completely with a highly beautiful box, flawlessly adorned completely with highly festive, bright Christmas designs. She gently handed it directly to Nicholas. "This is exclusively for you, my beautiful son. It is a highly gentle reminder that absolutely no matter exactly what happens, you absolutely always possess a highly safe place completely right here." Nicholas smoothly opened the highly decorated box to miraculously find a highly delicious collection entirely of fresh cookies, completely along with a highly intimate, handwritten note securely hidden completely inside. The highly powerful note explicitly read, "True family will absolutely always be your absolute greatest massive success." Those incredibly simple but highly powerful words violently resonated completely within him, violently awakening massive, highly complex emotions that he absolutely had not actively anticipated. As he incredibly carefully closed the highly decorated box, his wise mother actively seized the highly perfect moment to actively make a highly specific, massive suggestion. "I desperately want you to actively spend Christmas completely right here this exact year. It has been so incredibly long since we beautifully celebrated the highly festive holidays completely together, and I genuinely believe that you could highly benefit completely from a highly needed break, entirely from absolutely everything entirely, for a little while." Nicholas violently hesitated. He profoundly knew that she was 100% absolutely right. But the highly terrifying idea entirely of actively spending Christmas completely right there also explicitly meant violently facing massive, highly complex feelings that he had aggressively buried entirely for agonizing years. "I am absolutely not 100% sure, Mom. I actively possess incredibly much massive work entirely at the elite office. Perhaps exactly next year," he offered highly defensively, desperately hoping it would be absolutely enough. But she absolutely was not easily convinced. "Nicholas, you absolutely always say exactly that. I completely understand that your massive corporate work is highly important entirely to you. But true, absolute life absolutely does not wait. If you absolutely do not actively make massive time entirely for exactly what truly, genuinely matters, one highly agonizing day you will violently realize that it is way too incredibly, catastrophically late. Her heavy words violently struck him completely with massive force. He profoundly knew that she was 100% correct. Even if bravely admitting it absolutely wasn't incredibly easy. After exactly one highly heavy moment entirely of absolute silence, he heavily exhaled and fiercely nodded. "Okay, Mom, I will absolutely spend Christmas completely with you," she smiled radiantly. A highly beautiful look entirely of pure, absolute triumph, flawlessly softening her beautiful face. "I am incredibly, overwhelmingly happy to explicitly hear that. I am actively planning something highly special this exact year, and I genuinely believe it will absolutely be a highly magical Christmas that you will absolutely never, ever forget." Nicholas absolutely did not aggressively press entirely for the highly specific details, but her highly mysterious tone aggressively sparked his intense curiosity. As the pitch-black night finally fell, he warmly said goodbye, fiercely promising to rapidly return incredibly soon. On the highly quiet drive, completely back to his massive, empty mansion, her heavy words violently remained completely in his chaotic thoughts. He profoundly knew that his loving mother had absolutely always been his massive, greatest support. Even completely during the highly toxic times, exactly when he was way too incredibly, arrogantly absorbed entirely to actively realize it. Now, completely with her highly mysterious invitation entirely to actively spend Christmas completely together, he physically felt a highly complex mixture entirely of massive anxiety and highly intense anticipation. When he finally arrived safely home, he gently placed the highly decorated box entirely of cookies completely on the massive kitchen counter and intensely stared directly at it entirely for exactly a few quiet moments. The heavy words entirely of the handwritten note violently resonated completely in his brilliant mind. A highly stark, absolute reminder that entirely despite having successfully achieved absolutely all of his highly arrogant dreams, absolutely something massive was absolutely still violently missing. For the absolute first time for the absolute first time in an incredibly long time, he profoundly felt that there might actually be a highly genuine opportunity to actively reconnect completely with exactly what truly manly mattered. Genuinely, although he was absolutely not 100% sure of exactly what Christmas completely with his wise mother would miraculously bring. He profoundly felt that it was an absolute, highly necessary step, entirely in the absolute right direction. Nicholas tightly closed his piercing eyes, generously permitting the massive, crushing exhaustion entirely of the highly stressful day to completely wash entirely over him. But his loving mother's heavy words violently continued to aggressively echo. True family will absolutely always be your absolute greatest massive success. Nicholas's mom is planning a massive surprise. What do you think her secret plan is? Drop your best guess below. The single mother's secret, Elena violently woke completely up incredibly early. Exactly as she flawlessly did absolutely every single highly chaotic day. Completely to the highly strident, highly obnoxious sound entirely of her cheap alarm clock, which absolutely left zero microscopic room entirely for luxuriously staying completely in bed. The highly pale morning light beautifully filtered completely through the highly worn, cheap curtains entirely of her incredibly small, highly modest apartment, flawlessly illuminating a highly simple but impeccably neat room. The highly joyful, bright voices entirely of her beautiful daughters loudly echoed completely from the highly adjoining room, completely filling the tiny space entirely with pure laughter and highly playful, happy shouts, exactly as they enthusiastically prepared entirely for the highly busy day. She aggressively jumped completely out of the cheap bed, rapidly threw a highly comfortable sweater completely over her pajamas, and confidently headed directly straight, completely to the tiny kitchen to efficiently prepare a highly nutritious breakfast. The highly rich, delicious aroma entirely of cheap coffee beautifully filled the entire room, exactly as she rapidly prepared a highly massive platter entirely of hot toast, completely for the energetic girls. They were completely, utterly full, entirely, of pure, boundless energy, happily scurrying completely around the small table exactly as they eagerly, anxiously waited entirely for their hot food. "Mommy, Mommy, can we absolutely go directly to the beautiful park completely after school today?" Exactly one of them enthusiastically asked, her massive, radiant smile beautifully illuminating the entire tiny kitchen. Elena smiled beautifully, exactly as she smoothly poured herself a hot cup entirely of cheap coffee. "If you absolutely flawlessly finish your heavy homework exactly on time, we can absolutely go," she replied warmly, gently, lovingly stroking the top entirely of exactly one of their tiny heads, completely before sitting heavily down. As the identical triplets happily ate their hot breakfast, Elena successfully found herself deeply reflecting entirely on exactly how incredibly much her entire life had violently changed completely over the agonizing years. Things had aggressively taken a highly dramatic, massive turn completely since she had fiercely decided to permanently leave Nicholas. Although she had fiercely, passionately loved him incredibly deeply, she profoundly knew that cowardly staying explicitly meant aggressively continuing to physically feel completely, utterly invisible. A pathetic, highly neglected shadow entirely behind his highly relentless, toxic ambition. She had desperately attempted to actively talk completely with him, literally countless agonizing times. But he absolutely always, arrogantly, seemed way too incredibly busy to actually, genuinely listen. Highly romantic dinners had violently become highly lonely, pathetic affairs. Highly intimate conversations had violently turned completely into highly boring corporate monologues. And the highly pure, absolute love they had once beautifully shared had violently, slowly faded completely away. Slowly, exactly when she horrifyingly discovered that she was heavily pregnant, she felt completely, violently, overwhelmed entirely by absolute, crushing uncertainty. The highly terrifying idea entirely of fiercely raising her beautiful daughters completely alone was utterly, completely terrifying. But cowardly staying and aggressively enduring the highly toxic, freezing indifference entirely of Nicholas physically felt infinitely, significantly worse. With her fragile heart completely, violently shattered, she highly bravely left him a highly brief, completely honest note, explicitly explaining her massive decision, and confidently left completely before she could absolutely ever miraculously change her massive mind. She miraculously found a highly modest, incredibly quiet place to successfully rebuild her entire life, completely far, far away, entirely, from the massive luxury and highly toxic success they had once beautifully shared. Throughout the agonizing years, she brutally worked completely tirelessly to fiercely support her beautiful daughters, bravely facing the massive, highly terrifying challenges entirely of actively being a highly exhausted single mother, but absolutely always remaining incredibly, fiercely firm, entirely in her absolute determination to successfully give them an infinitely better life. That specific busy morning, exactly as she confidently walked directly to work, completely after safely dropping the energetic girls completely off entirely at the local school, Elena deeply thought entirely about the massive, highly agonizing sacrifices she had violently made, and the highly toxic, massive secrets she had aggressively kept. She had absolutely never, ever explicitly told Nicholas entirely about his beautiful daughters. Absolutely not entirely, because she maliciously wanted to aggressively hide them completely from him, but entirely because she was absolutely terrified that he was completely, utterly, unprepared entirely for the massive, profound responsibility. For agonizing years, she desperately told herself that she had successfully made the absolute right, massive decision, even if the massive, crushing weight entirely of it highly frequently, violently tormented her. Her highly exhausting job entirely, in a highly small, local boutique, absolutely wasn't highly glamorous, but it flawlessly provided the highly necessary, absolute stability she desperately needed to successfully care completely for her beautiful girls. Her highly busy days peacefully passed entirely by actively helping highly demanding customers, meticulously organizing the highly messy inventory, and beautifully dreaming entirely of a significantly brighter, massive future, completely for her beautiful family. Despite absolutely all the massive difficulties, she miraculously found immense, pure joy entirely in the highly small, beautiful moments. The incredibly fierce hugs entirely of her beautiful daughters, completely at the absolute end, entirely, of the highly exhausting day. Their pure, unadulterated laughter, exactly as they happily played completely together. And the highly rare, beautiful moments entirely of pure peace, exactly when he could peacefully sit down to quietly read a good book. One highly surprising afternoon, exactly as she was rapidly finishing her highly exhausting shift completely at the tiny store, she suddenly received a highly unexpected, massive phone call. It was absolutely Nicholas's mother, although they had tragically lost complete contact completely after Elena had violently left. They had absolutely always miraculously maintained a highly respectful, beautiful relationship. Hearing her highly familiar voice violently awakened a highly complex mixture entirely of massive surprise and deep nervousness entirely in Elena. Elena, I profoundly know that this highly sudden call is incredibly unexpected, but I desperately need to actively speak completely with you, the older woman stated entirely in a tone that was completely, simultaneously highly kind and incredibly firm. "Of course, ma'am. Is absolutely everything perfectly fine?" Elena nervously asked, absolutely not knowing exactly what to actively expect. "I desperately want to formally invite you directly to my highly special Christmas dinner this exact year. I profoundly know that you and Nicholas are absolutely not actively in contact, but I genuinely believe it is officially time to actively heal some highly agonizing, deep wounds." Elena violently paused, actively taking a massive, deep moment to completely assimilate the highly shocking, massive invitation. The highly terrifying idea entirely of violently facing Nicholas completely after so many agonizing years violently filled her entirely with a highly complex mixture, entirely of massive anxiety and intense curiosity. "I am absolutely not 100% sure that is a highly good idea. So incredibly many massive things have violently happened," she nervously began. But Nicholas's wise mother smoothly interrupted her incredibly softly. "I completely understand, Elena, but I desperately want you to deeply think entirely about it. I genuinely believe it could highly possibly be a highly important, massive moment entirely for absolutely everyone." After the highly intense call finally ended, Elena sat completely, utterly, in absolute silence, deeply reflecting entirely on the highly shocking, massive invitation. She profoundly knew that violently facing Nicholas would absolutely be a highly terrifying, massive challenge, but completely deep down, she profoundly felt that it highly possibly might actually be the absolute perfect time to violently confront the highly toxic past she had absolutely been aggressively avoiding entirely for so incredibly long. That exact night, exactly as she happily ate a highly simple dinner completely with her beautiful daughters, she intensely looked directly at their highly innocent, pure faces, completely filled entirely with absolute joy. She agonizingly wondered exactly what their beautiful lives would truly, genuinely be exactly like if they actually had the massive, incredible opportunity to formally meet their biological father. If they could successfully build a highly beautiful, genuine connection completely with him. Although she was absolutely, blindly terrified entirely of Nicholas's highly explosive, massive reaction, exactly when he finally, horrifyingly learned the absolute truth. She profoundly realized that she absolutely could not actively continue aggressively hiding it completely forever. In the highly chaotic days that violently followed, Elena successfully found herself deeply thinking significantly more and more entirely about the highly mysterious invitation. Beautiful memories entirely of the highly happy moments she had beautifully shared completely with Nicholas violently resurfaced. Their pure laughter and their absolute, highly genuine love completely before toxic work and blinding ambition had violently, ruthlessly separated them. She absolutely also vividly remembered the highly agonizing anguish entirely of her tragic departure, the highly terrifying uncertainty entirely of fiercely raising her beautiful daughters completely alone, and the highly agonizing nights she violently spent aggressively questioning herself if she had successfully made the absolute right massive decisions. After massive amounts entirely of highly deep self-reflection, she finally, fiercely decided to bravely accept the highly terrifying invitation. Violently facing Nicholas would absolutely not be incredibly easy, but she profoundly knew that she absolutely could not actively continue heavily carrying the massive, crushing weight entirely of her highly toxic, massive secret. On the highly freezing morning entirely of Christmas Day, Elena violently woke completely up incredibly early, to aggressively prepare. She lovingly helped her beautiful daughters flawlessly dress entirely in their absolute finest clothes, carefully explaining entirely to them that they were actively going to formally meet absolutely someone highly special. Although she absolutely did not generously give them absolutely all the highly complex details, she desperately wanted them to be completely ready entirely for exactly what would violently come. As she stared intensely directly at herself, completely in the cracked mirror, she vividly saw a highly complex mixture entirely of deep nervousness and absolute, unbreakable resolution. She profoundly knew that the highly explosive night would violently, permanently change their beautiful lives completely forever. But she fiercely trusted that she was actively making the absolute right, massive decision upon vividly seeing her beautiful daughters happily playing entirely in the small living room. She smiled radiantly. Absolutely no matter exactly what violently happened, she was fiercely determined entirely to bravely face it completely for them. When the exact moment finally arrived to confidently leave, she gently took absolutely each of her beautiful daughters firmly by the soft hand and confidently walked completely out entirely of the small apartment. The highly crisp, freezing afternoon air completely enveloped them exactly as they confidently walked directly toward the cheap car that would aggressively take them completely to Nicholas's mother's cozy house. With every single, deliberate step, they bravely took significantly closer. Elena absolutely could not magically shake the highly terrifying, massive sensation that her entire life was actively about to violently take a highly unexpected, massive turn. Elena kept the triplets a secret for years. Do you think she was right to hide them from Nicholas? What would you have done? Let us know below. The Christmas revelation. Nicholas's mother's highly cozy house brilliantly shone completely, with highly soft, beautifully flickering Christmas lights, flawlessly creating a highly warm, incredibly festive atmosphere. The highly delicious smell, entirely of freshly cooked hot food, beautifully floated completely in the crisp air, flawlessly mixing entirely with the highly soft, beautiful sound entirely of classic Christmas carols, playing beautifully in the warm background. Elena safely arrived completely with her beautiful daughters, who intensely looked completely with pure, unadulterated awe, entirely at the highly sparkling, massive decorations and the highly magical, beautiful glow entirely of the bright lights. She took a massive, incredibly deep breath completely before softly knocking entirely on the heavy door, desperately attempting to violently calm the massive nerves that had aggressively built completely up entirely for agonizing days. Nicholas's loving mother smoothly opened the heavy door completely with a highly massive, radiant smile, her beautiful face brilliantly lighting completely up entirely with highly genuine warmth exactly upon vividly seeing them. She gracefully leaned completely down to fiercely hug Elena, and then smoothly knelt completely down to warmly greet the tiny girls, who politely responded highly timidly, but completely with massive curiosity. Welcome, please, confidently come directly in. The massive dinner is absolutely ready, she stated highly enthusiastically, gracefully ushering them completely inside. Elena looked intensely completely around, actively noticing the highly familiar, beautiful details she vividly remembered completely from the highly few times she had actively visited. The highly old photos absolutely still proudly adorned the warm walls, and a highly massive, flawlessly decorated Christmas tree proudly stood exactly as the highly magnificent centerpiece entirely of the cozy living room. Although she desperately tried to flawlessly maintain her absolute calm, her brilliant mind was violently racing, frantically imagining the highly explosive, massive moment exactly when she would vividly see Nicholas. The tiny girls, highly excited completely by the highly festive atmosphere, aggressively began to happily explore the massive room, meticulously examining every single tiny detail. Nicholas's loving mother happily showed them the massive tree and even generously permitted them to happily hang a highly few more beautiful ornaments, which successfully made them smile radiantly. Elena intensely observed them, profoundly feeling a highly complex mixture entirely of massive pride and deep, agonizing unease. She profoundly knew that exactly what was actively about to violently happen would permanently, violently change their beautiful lives completely forever. Meanwhile, Nicholas confidently arrived completely at the highly cozy house exactly a few short minutes significantly later. He smoothly parked completely in the massive driveway and remained entirely in the luxury car, entirely for exactly one highly brief moment, intensely staring directly at the bright lights, happily flickering completely on the warm porch. He had generously accepted his loving mother's highly mysterious invitation, but absolutely something massive, entirely in the freezing night, physically felt incredibly, completely different. During the highly chaotic last few days, she had aggressively insisted that this highly specific Christmas would absolutely be incredibly special. Although she had absolutely not explicitly shared highly many specific details. Finally, he aggressively turned completely off the heavy engine, smoothly exited the luxury car, and flawlessly adjusted his expensive designer jacket completely before confidently heading directly to the heavy door. Upon confidently entering, he was warmly welcomed completely with a highly fierce hug entirely from his loving mother, and the highly familiar, beautiful aroma entirely of the massive Christmas dinner that beautifully filled the entire house. He smiled radiantly, exactly as he warmly greeted her. But his highly chaotic mind was violently divided entirely between the absolute present and the beautiful memories that this cozy home absolutely always powerfully evoked. He confidently headed directly to the massive living room, aggressively expecting to comfortably find the highly familiar, usual guests. But he completely, violently, stopped entirely dead in his tracks the absolute microsecond he confidently entered. Directly in front of him was Elena. His massive heart literally physically felt exactly as if it violently skipped a massive beat, exactly upon vividly seeing her completely after absolutely all those agonizing years. She was actively standing perfectly near the massive tree. Her highly complex expression, an absolute mixture entirely of massive surprise and deep nervousness, all completely around her. Exactly 3 tiny, highly identical little girls were happily playing completely with the bright ornaments entirely on the massive tree. Nicholas physically felt exactly as if absolutely all the heavy air had been violently, aggressively sucked completely out of the massive room entirely, as he frantically attempted to logically process exactly what he was vividly seeing. "Elena," he whispered incredibly softly, almost completely breathless, utterly incapable entirely of violently tearing his piercing eyes completely away entirely from her. Although she had actively anticipated this highly explosive moment, she literally could not magically avoid the massive, highly tight knot that violently formed completely in her dry throat. She slowly took exactly one highly cautious step directly toward him, desperately attempting to flawlessly maintain her absolute composure. "Hello, Nicholas," she stated incredibly quietly, her beautiful voice highly firm entirely despite the highly slight, violent tremor entirely in her soft hands. The highly heavy, suffocating silence that violently followed was suddenly broken completely by the tiny girls, who rapidly turned completely around to intensely look directly at the massive man who had literally just confidently arrived. Their massive eyes, highly identical and brilliantly bright, wonderfully shining completely with pure, unadulterated curiosity. Nicholas literally could not violently stop intensely staring directly at them, actively noticing their highly dark hair and the highly specific features that visually looked incredibly, terrifyingly familiar. "Who exactly are they?" he finally asked. Although completely deep down, he absolutely already profoundly suspected the absolute, highly terrifying answer. Elena took a massive, incredibly deep breath, completely before softly responding, profoundly knowing that she absolutely could not magically avoid the highly massive question. "They are officially your biological daughters," she stated with a highly firm voice, but heavily loaded completely with massive, pure emotion. The massive, crushing weight entirely of her heavy words violently hit him exactly all at once. Nicholas physically felt exactly as if the solid floor completely under his expensive shoes was violently, aggressively moving. He intensely looked directly at Elena, frantically searching entirely for absolutely any highly microscopic sign that absolutely all of this was simply a highly terrible, massive misunderstanding. But the absolute, brutal honesty entirely in her beautiful expression absolutely left zero microscopic room entirely for pathetic doubt. "Exactly how the hell could you absolutely not explicitly tell me?" he asked, his deep voice violently trembling completely under the massive, crushing weight entirely of the blinding shock, the massive confusion, and the pure, unadulterated anger. Elena fiercely held his piercing gaze, although the massive, agonizing pain entirely in her beautiful eyes was completely, utterly unmistakable. "It was a highly massive decision I fiercely made exactly at that highly toxic time. I genuinely, truly thought it was absolutely for the absolute best, entirely for them, and entirely for you. You were absolutely not completely prepared entirely to be a true father, Nicholas. I was absolutely not completely ready to bravely face it completely alone either. But I aggressively did exactly what I genuinely believed was the absolute right thing." Nicholas aggressively ran a massive, shaking hand completely through his dark hair, frantically attempting to logically process absolutely everything he had literally just horrifyingly heard. The tiny girls intensely observed him completely with massive curiosity, utterly oblivious entirely to the highly toxic, massive tension that completely filled the entire room. Exactly one of them, the absolute boldest entirely of the tiny group, slowly approached him incredibly cautiously, securely holding a highly small, beautiful Christmas ornament entirely in her incredibly tiny hands. "Are you officially our dad?" she asked incredibly innocently, her tiny voice beautifully breaking the heavy silence. The highly massive question violently took him completely by massive surprise, but it absolutely also forcefully compelled him to actively focus entirely on exactly what truly, genuinely mattered. He intensely looked directly at the tiny girl, then completely at Elena, who slowly nodded incredibly softly, generously giving him absolute permission to bravely take exactly one massive step entirely forward. Nicholas smoothly crouched completely down entirely to her highly tiny level, intensely looking directly entirely into her massive eyes. "Yes," he finally stated, his deep voice beautifully softening. "I genuinely believe I absolutely am." His heavy words miraculously came completely with a highly massive sensation, entirely of pure warmth, that he had absolutely not actively expected. The tiny girl smiled radiantly and happily handed him the beautiful ornament. The exactly 2 other girls, highly encouraged entirely by the beautiful interaction, absolutely also slowly approached him, beautifully surrounding him completely with a highly quiet, pure curiosity. In that exact, highly magical moment, Nicholas profoundly felt absolutely something massive, violently change completely in the absolute deepest part entirely of himself. Although the highly explosive situation was incredibly overwhelming, it was absolutely also undeniably, profoundly beautiful. Elena remained standing perfectly at a highly safe distance, completely with hot tears, beautifully shining entirely in her eyes. She had violently dreaded this highly explosive moment entirely for so incredibly long. But vividly seeing Nicholas beautifully, with the tiny girls, violently awakened a highly massive hope that she absolutely had not genuinely felt entirely in agonizing years. Exactly at that highly perfect moment, Nicholas's wise mother confidently entered the massive room, beautifully breaking the highly toxic tension completely with her highly familiar, pure warmth. It explicitly seems exactly like absolutely everyone is finally, beautifully getting to know absolutely each other, she stated completely with a highly cheerful voice. Why don't we absolutely all happily sit completely down entirely for a massive dinner? She gracefully gestured completely toward the massive dining table that she had meticulously prepared completely with so incredibly much massive care. Absolutely everyone confidently headed directly to the massive dining room, exactly where the heavy atmosphere violently became, significantly, incredibly lighter. Although there was absolutely still incredibly much massive history to aggressively address, the absolute first massive step had successfully been actively taken. During the highly delicious dinner, Nicholas intensely listened incredibly carefully, exactly as the tiny girls happily shared their beautiful interests and highly innocent dreams. He aggressively began to actively ask them highly engaging questions, desperately trying to completely understand exactly who they truly were, and exactly what massive role he could highly possibly play entirely in their beautiful lives. Elena, although absolutely still highly nervous, aggressively began to profoundly feel that perhaps bravely accepting the highly terrifying invitation had actually been the absolute right massive decision. For the absolute first time in agonizing years, she vividly saw the massive possibility entirely of a significantly brighter, massive future. Absolutely not only entirely for her beautiful daughters, but absolutely also entirely for her, and entirely for Nicholas. They absolutely both profoundly understood that the massive road completely ahead would absolutely not be incredibly easy, but they were completely, fiercely willing to bravely try. Nicholas finally meets his identical triplet daughters. Do you think he can be a good father after all this time? Share your thoughts below. The path to forgiveness, significantly later that exact night, completely after the highly massive dinner that violently, permanently changed their entire lives. Nicholas literally could not peacefully sleep. His brilliant mind was completely inundated entirely with highly massive questions, highly agonizing memories, and highly complex emotions that he had aggressively buried entirely for agonizing years, horrifyingly discovering that he was officially the biological father entirely of exactly 3 identical girls, had violently taken his absolute breath completely away. But it had absolutely also violently awakened absolutely something massive entirely inside him. Something massive that he absolutely could no longer stubbornly ignore. He desperately wanted to explicitly know significantly more, to profoundly understand exactly what had violently happened, and most importantly, exactly why Elena had aggressively kept him completely in the highly terrifying dark entirely for so incredibly long. The absolute very next morning, exactly as the bright, warm sunlight aggressively began to beautifully heat his mother's cozy house, Nicholas vividly saw Elena entirely in the highly small, beautiful backyard. She was sitting peacefully entirely on a worn wooden bench, intensely watching the tiny girls happily play completely on the green grass. Their pure laughter and highly carefree, bright smiles violently contrasted highly sharply completely with her incredibly serious, highly distant expression, completely lost entirely in her highly deep thoughts. He slowly approached her incredibly silently, absolutely not wanting to aggressively intrude. But Elena actively noticed him and generously gave him a highly faint, brief smile. Nicholas sat heavily completely down entirely beside her. The heavy silence violently persisted entirely for a highly short while completely before he bravely broke it. Elena, we desperately need to actively talk. There are way too incredibly many massive things that I simply absolutely do not completely understand, he stated. His deep tone a highly complex mixture entirely of massive urgency and highly forced restraint. She nodded fiercely, profoundly knowing that this highly terrifying conversation was absolutely inevitable. It was officially time to violently confront the absolute brutal truth, even if actively reliving those highly agonizing memories would absolutely surely violently hurt. I explicitly owe you a massive explanation, Nicholas, Elena stated, actively taking a massive, incredibly deep breath exactly as she frantically gathered her highly chaotic thoughts. She slowly began to painfully recount exactly how, entirely in the absolute last agonizing months entirely of their beautiful relationship, she had profoundly felt increasingly, incredibly invisible entirely in his massive life. Nicholas had absolutely always been incredibly busy, highly focused entirely on his elite career, completely consumed entirely by his highly arrogant goals. Although she had desperately attempted to actively talk completely with him, literally countless times, he absolutely never, ever seemed to truly, genuinely listen. When I horrifyingly discovered that I was heavily pregnant, I was absolutely terrified, highly terrified entirely of exactly how you would violently react. Highly terrified that you absolutely wouldn't desperately want to aggressively assume the massive responsibility. But significantly more than absolutely anything, I was absolutely terrified that the tiny girls would tragically grow completely up profoundly, feeling that they absolutely did not matter entirely to you, exactly as I profoundly felt completely during those absolute last, highly agonizing months, she admitted brokenly, her beautiful voice violently trembling. Nicholas heavily lowered his piercing gaze, her heavy words violently touching a highly sensitive, massive nerve. He could exactly now vividly see exactly how incredibly absorbed he had actively been entirely in his absolute own, massive world, completely missing the highly obvious, massive signs that Elena was actively slipping completely away. But why exactly didn't you explicitly tell me completely afterward? Why exactly didn't you generously give me the highly massive opportunity to actively be right there entirely for them? He demanded, desperately trying to fiercely contain his massive frustration, although his deep voice slightly betrayed him. Elena sighed incredibly heavily and slowly picked completely up a highly fallen leaf entirely from the nearby tree, gently turning it completely over entirely in her soft hands. I desperately tried to actively call you exactly once, agonizing months completely after I violently left, she began, her beautiful tone heavily tinged completely with massive sadness. But exactly when I bravely did, I clearly heard the highly loud sound entirely of a massive corporate meeting entirely in the busy background. You were highly enthusiastically talking entirely about a massive new project, and you sounded so incredibly happy, so incredibly focused. I simply, absolutely couldn't physically do it. I genuinely thought it was significantly better to simply let you happily continue actively living your massive life completely without that highly toxic burden. Her heavy words violently struck Nicholas exactly like a massive, heavy hammer. He profoundly realized exactly then, exactly how incredibly much his arrogant decisions had violently affected absolutely not only Elena, but absolutely also the beautiful daughters he absolutely didn't know miraculously existed. You were absolutely never a highly toxic burden completely to me, Elena. Absolutely neither you nor the tiny girls. I am so incredibly, profoundly sorry if I absolutely ever toxically made you physically feel exactly that terrible way, he stated, his deep voice completely loaded entirely with pure, absolute sincerity. Elena looked deeply at him, highly surprised entirely by the raw, unadulterated vulnerability completely in his deep tone. She had aggressively expected toxic anger or highly bitter resentment, but completely in its absolute place, she miraculously found highly genuine, pure remorse. It was incredibly difficult, Nicholas, she admitted softly, fiercely raising them completely alone, brutally working to aggressively support ourselves, meticulously ensuring that they absolutely never, ever lacked absolutely anything. But entirely in the absolute end, it was 100% absolutely worth it. They are my absolute greatest massive pride. And I would aggressively do absolutely all of it completely over again if I absolutely had to. Nicholas responded completely, with a highly complex mixture entirely of massive determination and profound tenderness. He intensely observed the tiny girls exactly as they happily ran completely through the small yard, their pure laughter beautifully filling the crisp air, entirely in them. He vividly saw beautiful fragments entirely of himself, and completely of Elena, a highly beautiful mixture that completely fascinated him and violently overwhelmed him. I desperately want to actively be an absolute part entirely of their beautiful lives, to actively be their true father. Although I profoundly know that I absolutely cannot magically recover the agonizing time that I violently lost, he finally stated, actively breaking the heavy silence. Elena intensely looked directly at him completely again, this specific time completely with a highly faint, beautiful smile, exactly as if she were finally completely ready to generously give him a highly massive chance. That strictly depends entirely on you, Nicholas. They are absolutely wonderful little girls, but they will desperately need significantly more than absolutely just empty words. They desperately need absolute action, massive commitment. If you truly, genuinely want to actively be right there entirely for them, you will absolutely have to fiercely prove it. He nodded fiercely, enthusiastically accepting the massive challenge. He profoundly knew that it absolutely would not be incredibly easy, but entirely for the absolute first time in agonizing years. He profoundly felt completely ready to bravely try. He had miraculously found an absolute purpose that aggressively went significantly beyond his elite career or his highly arrogant personal achievements. Nicholas is trying to be a father to the triplets. What is the first thing he should do to earn Elena's trust? Share your best advice below. The Christmas Miracle. On the highly magical morning entirely of Christmas Day, Nicholas's mother's cozy house was completely, beautifully calm. The highly pale sunlight beautifully filtered incredibly softly, completely, through the large windows, flawlessly adorned completely with beautiful garlands. And the highly delicious smell entirely of rich, hot chocolate beautifully filled the crisp air. The tiny girls were the absolute first to violently wake completely up, enthusiastically brimming completely with massive excitement entirely, to vividly see the massive gifts actively waiting completely for them, entirely under the massive tree. The beautiful sound entirely of pure laughter loudly resonated completely throughout the entire house, exactly as the tiny girls frantically rushed directly to the massive living room, exactly where the highly imposing Christmas tree was flawlessly adorned, completely with beautifully flickering lights and highly sparkling, bright ornaments. Elena, absolutely still completely half asleep, slowly emerged completely from her cozy room entirely to miraculously find the tiny girls eagerly, frantically searching completely among the highly beautifully wrapped packages. A highly radiant smile beautifully spread completely across her beautiful face, exactly as she intensely watched their pure, unadulterated joy. Meanwhile, Nicholas, who had fiercely decided to actively spend the entire festive holidays completely at his mother's house, was absolutely already entirely in the warm kitchen, happily helping completely with the hot breakfast. He was awkwardly wearing a highly funny apron that fit him incredibly loosely, something that the tiny girls instantly, highly playfully noticed, generously leading entirely to highly playful, happy jokes. Nicholas confidently approached Elena completely with a highly steaming cup entirely of expensive coffee, and gently handed it directly to her. She happily accepted it completely, with a highly soft, beautiful smile, deeply grateful entirely for the highly considerate, thoughtful gesture. They remained standing perfectly together, intensely watching the tiny girls happily open their absolute first massive gifts, beautifully savoring the pure calm entirely of the highly magical moment. A highly rare rarity that absolutely neither of them aggressively took entirely for granted. Exactly as absolutely everyone happily. Exactly as absolutely everyone happily collaborated completely in actively preparing the massive Christmas meal. Nicholas's loving mother highly meticulously supervised the complex preparations completely with a highly attentive eye, flawlessly ensuring that every single, tiny detail was completely, utterly perfect. It was incredibly, absolutely evident that she was intensely enjoying actively having the entire family beautifully reunited completely under exactly one single roof. Something massive that had absolutely not miraculously happened entirely in agonizing years. When they finally, happily sat heavily down entirely at the massive dining table, the beautiful atmosphere was completely filled entirely with pure warmth and massive gratitude. The hot food was incredibly simple, but highly, utterly delicious, and the highly engaging conversation smoothly flowed incredibly easily, exactly as absolutely everyone happily shared beautiful stories and highly fond memories. The tiny girls, exactly as highly energetic, exactly as always, happily babbled completely non-stop, entirely about their massive gifts and highly exciting plans, completely for significantly later. During the delicious meal, Nicholas confidently stood completely up, gracefully raised his expensive crystal glass, and addressed the highly quiet room completely with a deep voice heavily loaded entirely with massive emotion. I desperately want to sincerely thank absolutely everyone completely for generously allowing me to actively be right here today. These highly chaotic last few weeks have absolutely been a massive, incredible gift that I absolutely never, ever expected. Elena, thank you so incredibly much, entirely, for bravely letting me directly into your beautiful lives. And entirely to you, my beautiful girls. Thank you so incredibly much, entirely, for flawlessly teaching me the absolute, true meaning entirely of pure, unadulterated happiness. The massive room remained completely silent entirely for exactly one highly profound moment. Completely, before the tiny girls violently erupted entirely into highly enthusiastic applause, brilliantly radiating completely with pure excitement. Elena's piercing gaze beautifully softened exactly as she looked deeply at Nicholas, profoundly recognizing the highly sincere, massive effort he was actively making to successfully be an absolute part entirely of their beautiful lives. After the massive lunch, the happy family confidently headed directly to the small backyard, exactly where the tiny girls happily played a highly enthusiastic game entirely of catch, exactly as the happy adults intensely watched, completely incapable entirely of actively resisting. Nicholas happily joined directly in, enthusiastically chasing the colorful ball and laughing incredibly freely, entirely, in a beautiful way that Elena had absolutely not vividly seen entirely in agonizing years. As the bright sun slowly set entirely in the massive sky, the highly exhausted girls smoothly returned directly to the cozy living room, exactly where the warm fireplace beautifully emitted a highly warm, cozy glow. They comfortably curled completely up entirely together on the massive sofa, completely under soft, warm blankets. Entirely, while Elena happily read completely out loud a beautiful Christmas story. Nicholas intensely observed entirely from a nearby comfortable chair, completely captivated entirely by the highly beautiful bond that Elena so flawlessly shared completely with her beautiful daughters. It was a highly beautiful scene that he had absolutely never, ever actively imagined entirely for his arrogant self. But exactly now, he absolutely could not violently imagine ever letting it completely go. Significantly later, entirely, in the dark night, Nicholas successfully found Elena completely in the warm kitchen, exactly as she was rapidly finishing cleaning the absolute last dirty dishes. He remained standing perfectly there, completely in silence, entirely for exactly one highly brief moment, completely before softly speaking. Today has absolutely been exactly one of the absolute happiest massive days entirely of my entire life. Thank you so incredibly much entirely for generously giving me this massive opportunity, Elena. I profoundly know that I absolutely cannot magically undo the highly toxic past, but I desperately want you to explicitly know that I am completely, totally committed entirely to our beautiful future and the massive future entirely of our beautiful daughters. Elena looked deeply at him completely, with a highly complex mixture entirely of massive surprise and deep emotion. In the highly chaotic last few weeks, she had vividly seen a completely, utterly different side entirely of Nicholas. Exactly one that was completely, fiercely willing to brutally work incredibly hard, completely for the beautiful people he fiercely loved. I completely know, Nicholas. There is absolutely still incredibly much massive work to aggressively rebuild. But I genuinely believe we are actively heading entirely in the absolute right, massive direction, she stated softly, gently placing a highly reassuring, soft hand completely on his broad shoulder. Exactly at that highly perfect moment, their beautiful daughters, highly curious exactly as always, violently burst directly into the busy kitchen, loudly interrupting the highly intimate conversation. They enthusiastically wrapped their incredibly tiny arms completely around Nicholas's strong legs, desperately asking him to happily read them exactly one more beautiful story completely before safely going to sleep. He absolutely could not fiercely say no, and happily guided them directly back entirely to the cozy living room, exactly where the happy family beautifully gathered completely around the warm fireplace. Nicholas's loving mother, peacefully sitting entirely in a nearby, comfortable rocking chair, intensely observed the highly beautiful scene, completely, with a highly profound look entirely of absolute satisfaction. Entirely for her. This highly special Christmas was significantly more than absolutely just simple, festive traditions. It was absolute, undeniable proof entirely of exactly how pure love and absolute forgiveness could miraculously, beautifully transform shattered lives. Before safely going to sleep, the tiny girls aggressively insisted entirely on happily hanging their colorful Christmas stockings completely on the warm mantle, completely with the highly innocent hope that they would be entirely filled, completely with sweet candy, entirely in the bright morning. Nicholas happily helped them, meticulously ensuring that absolutely everything was completely, utterly perfect, exactly as he lovingly tucked them securely into the massive bed. Absolutely each of them gently gave him a highly soft kiss directly on his pale cheek, a highly tiny gesture that profoundly, deeply moved his massive heart. That exact night, entirely while the absolute rest entirely of the cozy house peacefully slept, Nicholas remained completely alone entirely in the quiet living room, intensely staring directly at the highly decorated Christmas tree, and deeply reflecting entirely on exactly how incredibly much his massive life had violently changed entirely in so incredibly little massive time. He profoundly realized that he had successfully found absolutely something massive that all the elite money in the entire world could absolutely never, ever successfully buy. A true, beautiful family. When Elena surprisingly realized that he absolutely wasn't completely in his bed, she smoothly came completely down and magically found him sitting peacefully entirely on the massive sofa. She silently joined him entirely, sitting peacefully directly by his side completely, before finally, softly speaking. You have aggressively done so incredibly much entirely in these highly chaotic last few weeks, Nicholas. The tiny girls absolutely adore you, and I am actively, beautifully, beginning to clearly see the exact same wonderful man that I fiercely fell completely in love with exactly once before. Her heavy words violently took him completely by massive surprise, but he profoundly felt incredibly, massively grateful. I have absolutely never, ever been significantly more, absolutely sure, entirely of absolutely anything completely in my entire life. He softly responded, completely, with pure sincerity. I desperately want to actively be right here entirely for you. Absolutely not just for today, but completely, utterly forever. A highly hot, happy tear beautifully rolled completely down Elena's pale cheek, exactly as she fiercely nodded. She profoundly knew that the massive road completely ahead would absolutely not be incredibly easy, but she was completely, fiercely willing to bravely try. This highly magical Christmas had miraculously brought significantly more than absolutely just expensive gifts and massive celebrations. It had miraculously brought a highly massive opportunity to beautifully start completely over, to successfully heal highly toxic old wounds, and to aggressively build a massive, beautiful future completely together. That exact night, exactly as the heavy clock beautifully struck midnight, Nicholas and Elena beautifully shared a massive, highly intimate embrace that profoundly symbolized significantly more than absolutely just the massive end entirely of a highly special day. It flawlessly marked the absolute, beautiful beginning entirely of a highly massive, brand new chapter. A highly beautiful life that they were completely, fiercely ready to bravely face completely together, exactly as one true, absolute family. What an incredible journey of forgiveness, growth, and true redemption. What was your absolute favorite moment of Nicholas trying to win his family back? Could you have ever forgiven him like Elena did? Let us know in the comments below. If you felt every single emotion in this beautiful story, please smash that like button. Share it with someone who deeply believes in second chances, and subscribe to our channel for more life-changing stories. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.